All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing. Thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Happy to welcome back to the podcast Simon Rosenberg. He's the founder of NDN and the New Policy Institute. And more importantly, he is probably the man who was the most right about the midterms of anybody I saw, and wasn't just right, but was beating the drum regularly, letting everyone know that, hey, this red wave is not a foregone conclusion. Back for yet another victory lap. Simon Rosenberg, welcome back to the news.
It's good to be here, Matt. And listen, I want to give you credit for having been one of the first people who really allowed me to sort of air this out, to take this idea that there could be a different outcome. I even remember when you reached out to me, you were like, dude, what are you doing? Right? Like, you're sounding crazy out there. And, but I want you to come on and sound crazy onto my pod, And so we sounded crazy together back in a few months ago when we did this. But I just want to say for your listeners that you were absolutely one of the first people that took this seriously, that at least entertained it as a possibility. So kudos to you, Matt.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I will say that, you sort of sounded the alarm, or that it may not be a big red wave this summer. And then that looked right. That started to look right this summer. And then I had you back on to do a victory lap. And hey, you were right. And then September happened and October happened. And things started to change back again, sort of return to what we would think of as historical expectations. There were good reasons to believe that it would be a bad year for Democrats, just based on historical trends, based on Joe Biden's popularity or lack thereof, based on inflation. And I started inviting other analysts and very smart folks on the podcast. And they were not, they were preaching a different message than you were preaching. And so
Yeah.
I have to say, my Bill Scher and I over at the DMZ, we did our predictions, and my predictions, I think you helped me temper. I didn't go off the deep end too much. I'm still in the game in terms of the Senate. I predicted Republicans would win 51 seats, which still could happen. But for example, I predicted in Nevada that the Republican would win there, and he's up, but it's dicey. I predicted Herschel Walker would win. It's going to be a runoff, so I'm not sure how those are going to pan out. In the House, I had 23. I thought Republicans would gain 23, and I think it's looking more maybe like 10 or 15. But
No.
anyway,
it's going to be if they win it, and it's not even guaranteed that the House goes Republican right now. It's going to be 3 or 4 seats, and Kevin McCarthy is going to have a really rough time if he ends up becoming speaker. But let me go back to what happened in the election, right? Let's just wind back, because I think this is the most important thing. And it's exactly what we talked about, right, when I was on your show, which is that after Dobbs happened, the election changed. And we saw in all the intensity boxes, as we call it in our business, all the ways you measure intensity, Democrats showed incredible intensity in the 5 House specials that happened. We overperformed our 2020 numbers by 7 points. We then saw Democratic intensity in Kansas. We saw Democratic intensity in voter registration spikes all around the country. We saw our candidates outraising Republican candidates by huge margins all over the country, a universal thing. I mean, in the House races, our candidates probably outspent the Republicans in the last month by like 6-1, 4-1, right? In the actual candidates, not the outside groups, right? And then, so my question, and when I was on your show, what I kept saying is, the big question of the election was, would this intensity that we're seeing on the Democratic side, without a commensurate, there was no Republican intensity, right? They weren't raising money, their voter reg went down, right? They didn't perform well in these states. Was this basic dynamic, would it carry over to the general election, right? That was the question, the big question. Because why would it have changed? And I want to come back to this perception that it changed. I want to come back to that in a minute. But and then it did. And we saw in the early vote, Democrats dramatically outperformed our 2020 numbers all over the country. Shocking. I will tell you, I was looking at the data twice a day. It's getting updated twice a day on the Target Early site. And I couldn't believe how good it was every single day. There was no variance. There was like this just crushing, huge Democratic early vote. Republicans were not showing up. It was a big problem. We were writing and saying, look, I mean, all this stuff we saw earlier, it's showing up in the early vote. And you had people like Sean at Real Clear Politics saying, oh, the early vote doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. I mean, nobody was more wrong about this election than the guys at Real Clear Politics. Let's be clear about that, right?
And by the
So,
way, a lot of people, including
yeah,
them, that are highly respected and have gotten a lot of things right over the years,
yeah,
and um, and that I think that influenced me too. It's
yeah,
like, who do you listen to? Because you know they're different people who are both all sort of respected, saying
yeah.
different things.
Agreed. But the thing that was incredible is that I don't want to, I'm not going to sort of get into the fight with these guys, but I'm sorry for even bringing it up. But I think the point is there was an incredible effort by the Republicans to sort of say, look away from the early vote, because it was clear that this was a huge problem for them, right? Because it was, and then in the last week, when supposedly the bottom fell out of the Democratic Party, the early vote actually got 3 points better. It was getting better every single day of the final week. So there was
Yeah.
momentum, there was cascading momentum. So what Tom
And
Bonner and I,
I'm sorry to interrupt you though. I do want to say, I even had Steve Kornacki on, and he did. We have by the way, I love Steve Kornacki. He's a mensch, great guy, great analyst, all that. But we had him on for one of our DM Zooms where
yeah,
we our patrons come on and they could ask questions. And somebody asked him about the early vote, and he said, I don't take it into consideration. I don't factor it in.
well,
And so
Steve,
you were looking at that where a lot of people, and by the way, Steve Kornacki, I mean, he's not a right wing. He's not a right
I
wing
know,
nut trying to.
but to be fair, Steve blew the election. I mean, and so did Nate Silver, and so did a lot of people who do this for a living. And this whole question about like how did so many really smart people get it so wrong when there was a mountain of data? I mean, this is the whole point. Like we were sitting on my whole argument, and just to finish. So what happened was, we had this early vote. It was confirming what we had seen in the all these other indications of Democratic intensity. And so all Tom Bonnier and I were saying is, look, we're looking at a close competitive election. We're not looking at a red wave. There's never been evidence of a red wave, other than largely in right wing Twitter, right? And so we just said it's going to be a close competitive election, and that's what we have, right? And I think that obviously we're going to win a handful of these Senate. I think we're going to win, and I think Cortez Masto is going to win, and we've won in Arizona this morning, and I think that this is going to be
Wait
by
a
the
second.
narrow.
Wait a second. Did Katie? We're recording this on Friday morning. Are you
Yeah,
saying?
no. So
Are you
the
saying
governor's
that
race has,
Mark Kelly?
yeah, Mark Kelly is one in Arizona. The governor's
Mark
race
Kelly
is
is one, and but the Katie Hobbs race,
no.
we don't
She's
know
still
yet.
ahead. She's still ahead, which is
Okay.
amazing, right? And so we won't know that. We probably won't know that until well into next week, right? Is my guess. And Cortez Masto had this is on Friday. Cortez Masto, John Ralston just did an update, and all the early vote looks. I mean, all the vote that's outstanding looks very, very positive for her. For her, she's going to go up today in the count, and she'll be ahead, by midday Friday whenever they release this stuff. So our side is very confident she's going to win. We're probably going to lose the governor's race though in Nevada, which shows just how close this election was. I mean, this is a crazy close election, right? It's not Democrats overperform, but we still haven't locked down the Senate. To your point, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the House, but I will say there are a couple other things that people, to me, here are the things that will become more discussed next week. That are, once we get beyond the House and Senate, and that is that my basic view, there are three things I want to say. One is that MAGA was the big loser here, right? And Trump was the big loser. MAGA's had three consecutive bad elections or underperforming elections. It doesn't work as a national political strategy for the Republicans. I mean, this midterm was handed to the
Yeah.
Republican Party on a silver platter,
And
and they,
you called that out. You
yeah,
called that out this summer on this
yeah,
show.
yeah, and so I think that for the Republicans like you, Matt, who have and like Michael Steele and Matthew Dowd and Bill Kristol and Liz Cheney and who've had concerns about the MAGA takeover of your party, I hope that everyone realizes that you all are now in far stronger, firmer ground today than you were. My hope is that your wing of the sensible wing of the conservative movement in the Republican Party have a little bit of wind in your sails, and that the grip of MAGA on your party has been loosened. That's my hope, right? We'll see what happens. I mean, this is going to be a tough, battle, but certainly there's a lot of encouragement for those of us who would like to see a traditional center right, Republican Party return, in the coming years. That's certainly my hope, right? I mean, I don't. And so the second thing, though, is that what happened in Michigan has to be really processed by everybody, because we, in the early vote, let me give you an example. In the early vote, Democrats did 4% better across the country than we did in 2020 on average. In Michigan, it was 22 points better. And, Whitmer won by 11 points. We flipped the House and Senate there. There was an abortion ballot initiative on the ballot. And there was a complete wipeout of the Republican Party in a way that is still, in many ways, maybe seen within a few weeks as the biggest story of the midterms. This should be terrifying for Republicans about what this means for 2024 and beyond. The pain of ending Roe and the abortion restrictions that they put across the country could last for years and years and years, and until the Republican Party backs away and goes to some kind of national 15-week, ban, which is, as you know, will not happen in many states easily. And so the Republican Party is deeply, deeply out of position. That is a high voting issue for a lot of people, and this is going to get worse for them, not better, in my view. And then the third thing that I just found amazing today is that Democrats, we were the first incumbent party to not lose a single state legislative chamber in a midterm since 1934.
Wow.
Yeah, no, that is a wow. Isn't that a wow? I just saw this a few minutes ago.
Amazing.
Yeah. So there was, not only was there no red wave, there wasn't even a red ripple. I mean, there was nothing, right? I mean, this was just an unbelievably status quo election. And in part, I want to just, my final conclusion, and then I'm done with my opening statement, sir, thank you, is that I think that part of where we are right now is that we went through a collective trauma as a country with COVID. I mean, COVID was horrible. And I don't think people wanted change and chaos. They actually didn't want to upset the apple cart. The reason why is because Joe Biden did a good job getting us through COVID and getting the economy back on track. And I don't care about polling, about the economy. There is a sense that things were settling down and we're finally coming out of this nightmare, and that we don't want any more chaos and nuttiness. And we just, so all the election deniers and many of the most extreme Republicans lost, because people they want to just get on with their lives, right? I mean, they just want to go back to coaching Little League and going to work and making dinners for their families. And they didn't want an upheaval. They didn't want change. They were okay with where things are. That only would have been the case if people were pretty happy with where we were, right? And so all this polling about wrong direction, right direction, the economy, everything else, I think also that stuff didn't really capture the moment of the sense that we were actually finally in the clear on the trauma, and that we couldn't risk doing something that would upset, this fragile recovery that we have. And so those are my thoughts today.
Yeah. Well, let me drill down on that, because look, I know there were junk Republican polls trying to work the refs, but there were a lot of legitimate media, mainstream media polls that consistently showed that the number one issue voters cared about was the economy and inflation by a long shot. And abortion was fourth or fifth, or depending. It was not. It was a distant third at best.
But not with Democratic voters. I mean, this is where the media was really wrong again and again. And if you remember, Matt, I mean, I used to produce this chart where I would go into these polls and show the difference between number one, number two, number three issue with Democrats and number one, number two, and three with Republicans. Abortion was always number one and number two for Democratic voters. It always was. It never dropped down. And it dropped down with Republicans, which is why the numbers went down. So this was, again, in my view, this was a purposeful misread of the data by Republicans who couldn't really accept the notion that something that they have so much disdain for, right? Abortion, and just so much, such a visceral kind of just passionate, opposition to. They just couldn't believe that this could be the thing that could cause them to lose the election. And so I think the Republicans sort of invented a story about what was happening in the election for their comfort, and it was not actually what was happening in the election, right? And
I actually disagree with you there. I mean, I'm pro-life, and I always try to be introspective, and allow for the possibility that I am subconsciously biasing things. But when I see polls by like the Washington Post or the New York Times, and those polls, are mainstream media outlets, they don't have an agenda. It's certainly not a right wing agenda. And they show me voter preference and what voters say is important to them. And they say that the economy is the number one thing that they're voting on. I don't think it's me being biased when I take that data and say, oh, the economy must be the most important thing
No,
this election.
but let me try to explain why this was all muddled, and let me go through this. Right. So what I think did happen in about a month ago, 5 weeks ago, was that when Saudi Arabia and Russia raised gas prices around the world and raised energy prices around the world, the Republicans got a little bit of a bump. I mean, Biden's numbers came down a little bit. It was like a 2 point bump. And then what happened also at that time was that a lot of the Republican candidates who were doing really poorly, at that point, Oz and and other candidates who were in the low 40s sort of jumped up to like 45, 46, where they were going to be no matter what. I mean, the Republicans' floor in this election was 47, 48, and so all of their candidates who were underperforming were at some point going to start moving up. And that all happened like at the same time, right around that same time, like a month ago. So there was movement, but it wasn't movement to them being ahead. It just was they were less behind, and which was something that was always going to happen in the election. And I think that a lot of people got over their skis a little bit by confusing movement with victory, right? And there were a lot of now. I mean, I showed this in my thread this morning. The final 7 nonpartisan tracking polls, national tracking polls of the election on 538 had us up 1.5 points.
Wow.
And
No, and I saw you tweeting that, man, and I was like, okay, so then
no, I mean,
I'm like, I admire you.
yeah,
I admire your tenacity and that you don't back down,
yeah.
but get with the program.
No, but I mean, but that's actually what happened in the election. I mean, Democrats dramatically overperformed all expectations because I think that I think the red wave narrative that took off in a month ago, 5 weeks ago, the second red wave, right, that you talked about, sort of blinded people to looking at data that didn't comport with the red wave narrative. The early vote didn't comport with the red wave narrative, so it was dismissed. All this positive polling for Democrats. I would argue that in the last 3 weeks of the election, the polling was actually far better for us than for Republicans, to be honest. When you look at the aggregate of all the polling, not the averages, which were gamed and worked by the Republicans, but if you just strip out the nonpartisan independent polls, we were clearly ahead in most of the major Senate races. We were clearly, we were doing far better in the generic than was the
Yeah.
average, right? And we had, all these Hispanic polls, these Univision and Telemundo polls that dropped in the last 5 weeks were crazy positive for us. We had a crazy
Yeah.
positive national youth poll. So my view was, in assembling my theory of the case, right, was this positive nonpartisan polling, not the gamed polling averages, were telling you a very different story than what you were getting if you were just looking at RCP or at the averages, right? Which is that the election was 2 to 3 points more Democrat than people understood, which is where I think it ended up. I mean, we
Right.
basically ended up
Well,
in a jump ball election, right?
help me understand, why does Nate Silver and Henry Olson and Dave Wasserman and Steve Kornacki, and Sean Trendy, and go down the list. Smart, respected people. I don't think some of them they've got different political ideological worldviews, but I think mainly they'd like to be right about their prognostications. I assume that would be good for them for their careers.
Yeah.
Why didn't they see this data?
Because as I said, I think that there was, so I don't really know the answer, but let me give you my sort of guess here, right? My explanation, perhaps, is that I think a lot of people got invested in the red wave narrative back in the spring. And they were embarrassed when it wasn't a red wave anymore, right? Back when we had that period where everyone moved away from the red wave narrative. And I think I think there was a lot of professional career sort of pride on the line, right? And people who had sort of invested a lot in the sense this was going to be a crappy Democratic election. And then when it turned out it might actually be a competitive election, which is all I ever said on your air. I never said we were going to win. I just said it was going
That's
to be
right. That's a
competitive.
very good point to
Yeah.
make.
Yeah. In fact, I didn't do any pre-election predictions. I always do pre-election predictions, and I didn't this time because I actually had no idea what was going to happen, to be honest. Right. And I looked at all my numbers, and it was far more positive than everybody else. And I wasn't really sure what the hell was going to happen. I mean, maybe I'm right. Maybe these other guys are right. It's what happens in elections. People get to decide, right? And
No,
so,
your tweets would say something like, you know, I don't know what's going to happen, but here's what I can tell you. Everything I'm seeing says the red wave is not materialized yet.
right,
This is like the day before the election.
No, on the morning of the election, I did a whole thread saying, "Here's what I'm seeing this morning," and I said the red wave may be coming, but it's not here yet. And I said I don't know what's going to happen tonight. I mean, it's a close competitive election, and in close competitive elections, it's like a college basketball game in the last 2 minutes. I mean, anything can happen, and in fact, we're seeing that, right? Republicans are winning a bunch of races that they weren't sure they were going to win. We're winning a bunch of races we weren't sure, by
Yeah.
small margins.
I just saw that David Trone
Yeah,
in Maryland, who's a filthy rich
yeah.
politician, incumbent congressman, is in danger of losing.
Yeah, and
Maryland.
And look, Republicans, the tell on election night, right, was early on. You often get really important signs very early on the East Coast on election night. And when we won that Rhode Island House seat, that every single poll taken in the general election had us losing that House seat. As you know, if you had Republicans on your show, that was one they had in the bank. It was guaranteed 100% we're going to win this seat. And we won it early. And I was like, whoa, this election doesn't look like the election everybody thought. And, one of the networks put up on their screen a shot of 538s or the polling in that race, and every single poll had the Republican winning. By the way, that was very similar to what happened in New York 19 in the special election. Every single poll had the Republicans winning that race, and we won by 2.5 points. And so what I'm arguing to you is that the election that materialized in June, July, August, and September was the election that happened. There wasn't any significant change. There was bouncing around within that framework, but that election that we all saw in those House specials in Kansas is the election that just happened. And what happened is that I think that the thing that caused the red wave, right, the red wave, the return of the red wave narrative, was Nate Cohn's New York Times poll that showed the race moving 4 points. And what happened, just so I can explain this to your listeners just for a second, polling is an art, it's not a science, right? I mean, there are, and particularly in a midterm election, when you have so many voters who are not sure they're going to vote, and particularly after 2 elections where the electorate expanded as much as it did, we have so many new voters in the electorate that trying to really understand who was going to vote was harder in this election probably than in any modern election because of just the nature of the expansion of
Was
the
that
election.
because of was that because of Dobbs? Is that what drove
No,
the voter registration?
yeah, it's just because the electorate expanded so much in 2018 and 2020. We had 2 of the highest turnout elections in American history back to back. And so what it means is,
Because Trump and the opposition to Trump
yep, both brought.
expanded the universe.
Yeah, no, there are a
Okay.
lot more Republicans, a lot more Democrats. I mean, the electorate grew by like 25% or something, right? Like it was just an enormous short-term expansion of the electorate. And so what it meant was the number of people that, in order to gauge in this election who was going to vote, it was much harder than usual because the number of people who were quote unquote irregular voters was much greater, right? And what a lot of those polls at the end that showed Republicans winning by 3 or 4 points had Republican intensity higher than Democratic intensity. And that was wrong, right? That is the key thing. And one of the things that Tom Bonnier talks about all the time is that polling has a very hard time engaging intensity. The questions are often not really designed to get a real answer. It's just designed to fill a polling spot. And what we started doing is we said, once we saw the early vote, we're like, look, any poll that has Republicans more intense than Democrats is just wrong, right? I mean, there is a lot of data here. So what's interesting is that going back to Kornacki, the final NBC poll that came out, right, was up us. We were up 1. in likely voters, and the intensity gap, right, had closed where the Republicans were more
Yeah,
intense.
I remember that.
Yeah. So
It
that
was like
poll,
on election day, and
yeah, yeah,
NBC had this poll that came out
right.
that showed that suddenly Democrats had closed the intensity gap.
Yeah, and that poll was correct. I mean, that poll, when that poll came out and it came out on Sunday, we looked at that poll and like, that's the same thing we're seeing in the early vote data. I mean, that poll was the first poll in our view that really captured the actual thing we were seeing on the ground with real voters, right? And so that's when I became much more confident, because we were seeing exactly the same data as they saw, right? The Democratic intensity over the
But they
final week grew, right? It actually got higher
but
and
they
higher.
must have. So you're saying you're saying that it's not that they were wrong before, it's that the intensity
I don't,
actually changed in the last week?
I no. Well, what I can say to you is that I think they were wrong before, but also Democratic intensity did rise, and
Okay.
one of the things that I'm curious about, that, and it'll be interesting for you to have Republicans on to talk about this, is that did all the red wave talk actually scare Democrats into voting? And it's very possible that
Yeah,
the Republicans pumping the red wave thing actually really backfired in them in the election,
yeah.
because
What about
we saw
Trump,
rising.
okay?
Yeah.
Trump had gone dark
Yep.
for the last month or two. Trump went dark, and then he reemerges the last several days before the election, and he's announces that he's going to announce for president. I
My
wonder if that had anything to do with it.
I think it would be marginal, because I don't think Democrats really pay much attention to him, frankly. I think that what was more threatening were the actual MAGA candidates in their states, right? That were reminding everybody every day about how nutty the Republican Party had become, right? And that's, I think, was much more proximate, was that, you had in virtually every state some some Mastriano like figure, right? Who, even if there were mainstream Republicans running on the ticket and more acceptable Republicans, the presence of the fear of MAGA and the scariness of MAGA and the chaos of MAGA was in the face of voters on the ground, right? And couldn't run away from it. And so I do think that the success of Trump in pushing his candidates in the Republican primaries was not just devastating for them in individual states, but it contributed to the sense nationally that it's not just Trump, it's everybody now has gone kind of crazy. And, we just can't accept that. We want the old Republican Party back, right? We don't want that Republican Party. And I will say one last thing, Matt, to your credit and to the credit, and I have been very vocal about this, that I think what Liz Cheney and Bill Kristol and Michael Steele, and if you put yourself in that camp, I mean, the people that like broke from MAGA and said, we're just not going there, created a national permission structure for that to happen all in states. And so you saw in Michigan, 150 Republican leaders endorse Whitmer. You saw similar things in Pennsylvania with Josh Shapiro, similar things in Arizona, in Nevada, and in Texas. And so there was this kind of super organized opposition of Republicans to convince other Republicans not to vote Republican. And I always was saying through the entire election, something like this, of this magnitude, could be 1 or 2 points, right? Liz Cheney running those ads in Arizona and going to Arizona could have been the reason that Mark Kelly won the election, right? It could be, and so I think the collective work of the anti-MAGA Republicans this cycle was actually deeply meaningful, deeply courageous, deeply brave, deeply patriotic. And I salute everybody, who was willing to do something much harder than what I was doing, which was just reflecting on the data I was seeing. Bucking your own party the way that many have done is really hard. And I want to just express my admiration and praise and respect for all the anti-MAGA Republicans who I think had a victory in this election, and thank God, right? And so, I've gotten to
Me
know,
too. I will echo that.
yeah,
I
and
will
so
echo that, especially people like Liz Cheney,
yeah,
who really put, you know, put it all on the line. Let me ask you, on election night, you might not have seen this because I'm sure you were inundated and busy, but I tweeted a congratulations to you publicly. I said, this, Simon got this right. And then, a couple days later, a day or so later, I DM'd you and congratulated you. Did you hear from other people who may have dismissed your work. Did they apologize, or did anybody reach out?
No, I mean, a lot of people reached out. I mean, I've gotten almost 50 million Twitter views in the last week, right? And I've picked up 50,000 followers the last few weeks. And to me, one of the most, yeah, it's been wild. I mean, and as you know, because you do this, right? When you have that level of intensity in your work, it's just, you get overwhelmed, right? Because there's a million people. And I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
there's a lot of people that I just want to apologize that I've not gotten back to because it's been a little bit crazy the last few days. Here's what I'd say about that. As you when you did the introduction today, you said something that was really important, which is that I was not shy with my point of view. I was not only writing it, but I was calling every reporter that I knew and banging on them on their door, challenging their stories, telling them that I thought they were wrong, asking them to consider alternative data. And so it's why so many journalists actually on election night and the day after said, I got to give Simon credit because they knew that I had pounded them.
Yeah,
And
you
they
were in
knew,
like Politico Playbook, for
yeah,
example.
but on Friday, I mean, I was making these things. I stuck to my guns, right? I mean, I put out a whole thread on election day. I didn't back away, right? And so, to their credit, a lot of reporters who basically ignored me or just didn't believe what I was saying, have DM'd me or written publicly, and it's been gratifying in that
Good for
regard.
them.
And yeah, no, I agree. Like, look at the New York Times today. I mean, Blake Hansel, who's a really sharp reporter, somebody I respect deeply in the New York Times, has a very interesting piece where he said there were sort of two theories of this election, right? There was one is this would follow traditional midterm physics, and there was this other theory that it was going to be unique. And the other theory won. And the chief guy making that argument was Simon Rosenberg. And so in the very first paragraph, like he gives me
Yep.
props. And Blake, I had a 4-hour back and forth with Blake over email like a week ago where he kept throwing stuff at me and I kept batting it down. And all these reporters know that I was, enthusiastic, perhaps is the right word to say, about making my case. Because look, I'm a former journalist and I want people to get stuff right. It's important for the country. I mean, I really believe in journalism as a tool for democracy, right? And helping citizens understand the country they live in. And so I spend a lot of time working with journalists to help them get their stories right.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and what's also been gratifying is that, I've gotten, people like Ron Klain and others have reached out and just thanked me for, not giving up. I mean, I got I think the funniest text I got or a message from anybody was, okay, I'll tell this story. I'm not sure I should tell this story, but the funniest text I got was, I was a senior advisor to the DCCC in 2018, and I helped flip the House, right? I was very involved in the strategy to flip the House. It was the first big victory against MAGA, right? And so I'm very close to the people in the DCCC, and I have been arguing internally, privately with them for months that I thought we could win the House, and that they needed to make sure that they ended their 3 months, their final 3 months, with a strategy that was about winning and not about holding. In soccer they call it parking the bus, right? And there's a completely different mindset. And what I was so gratified by is that they did that, and that they changed the way they executed the election to be more ambitious, to try to flip more seats. And one of the examples of that was that in the final, in the last month, they once a week, to all the people that give money to the DCCC, they would send out an email saying, here are the 8 candidates this week that need the most money, that are doing well, that need a little bit more. They're a little behind. And if you give here, it goes to all 8, right? And it's split. Those were always either the majority or at least half of the candidates every time they did that were pickup opportunities. So they were raising money in the final weeks for seats that we didn't hold, as opposed to
Wow.
hunkering
Yeah.
down, because they were confident that we could actually pick up seats, right? Because of the climate that we all. And so one of the folks at the DCCC, I went on election night when the data started coming in. I'm like, holy shit, this may actually be happening the way that I hoped, right? And she wrote
Yeah.
back, you were really the only one who believed this was possible.
You
and,
know,
and so, because what I want you to know is that here's the other thing, just for your listeners to understand about what happened in this cycle, is that the miss in 2020, right, where everyone sort of missed the shy Trump voter, whatever you want to call it, just haunted all the
Yep.
political coverage for the last 2 years. There are
Always
people,
fighting the last battle,
yeah, and
the
people were
last war.
terrified. And what I was saying to you on the air was that people should be as haunted by that miss as they were about the miss that happened in the 5 House specials and in Kansas, which, by the way, was about this election, not the last election. And there should have been an
Yeah.
equal concern to a different kind of miss this time. And there wasn't. I mean, and I will tell you that even our own pollsters, I mean, you saw quotes from Democratic operatives in the last few weeks saying the sky is falling, nuclear winter, right? I mean, one of the reasons that many commentators like Steve Kornacki and others believed that things were bad was because Democrats were telling them they were bad. But part of the reason why is that many of our pollsters made their polls 3 or 4 points more Republican than they really than they would have normally, because to make sure they didn't get burned by the shy Trump voter thing. And what may have happened on our side is that we collectively in the Democratic consultant class may have misread the election and ourselves, right? Like I think we bought into the red wave narrative ourselves, right? And
Yeah,
so,
it's like when remember this happens. It is a weird analogy, but remember that Nick Sandmann, the Covington kid,
yeah,
Covington Catholic kid,
yep,
and this happens a lot. When that scandal first happened, his own school threw him under the bus and apologized. And if you're a journalist and you see the guy's own school do that,
right.
that's almost like, well, obviously he's guilty. We're going to run with it now. And so I see it almost creates a permission structure. It's like even the Democrats think they're going to lose, right?
Yeah, and look, it was somebody tweeted out like a week before the elections about, somebody needs to send Democratic consultants to therapy, right? Like, they shouldn't be, expressing their anxiety so publicly. Like, it was just a very funny take because, and I think, look, I think that a lot of our, I think that there, I think that the dynamic you and I have discussed today about people kind of buying into the red wave, thinking traditional midterm physics were ultimately going to kick in, all this stuff, it gripped our entire party. And so what happened was that our party in the spring also started believing that a red wave was coming, and there was enormous pessimism in our family in a way that I had never really seen in all the years that I've been in this business. We may have even talked about it in one of our discussions, but and so when I started doing all my stuff, I mean, I got a text from somebody who's one of the major party committees saying, that every morning we would all get up and read your stuff, and it's what buoyed us and kept us going, and thought that it was really possible. And I knew what I was doing, right? I mean, I was acting like a cheerleader here because I do think I want to sort of getting to the end of this. I do want to say one other thing that I'm going to give you a homework assignment, and when I come back next year, we can chew on this. I think we have a real crisis in this country around negative and positive sentiment. I think that part of what I think the media and MAGA, not you, Matt, but is sort of they're putting too much negative sentiment into our discourse, and people are starting to lose faith in their country, their leaders, their institutions,
Absolutely.
their parties, their
Yep.
everything, right? And I think that we're doing better than all that. I mean, part of my core, the thing that sort of got me into the game this cycle was that I have this other presentation I do about the American economy, showing how many jobs have been created, how much growth there's been, the stock market. And then actually, we're doing unbelievably well relative to the rest of the world. And this sort of doom and gloom on the economy stuff was just not based on data, right? It was often based on attitudinal data, but not actually economic data. I mean, Joe Biden, in the last few months, I mean, we've had the lowest poverty rate in American history, the lowest unemployment rate in peacetime economy since World War II, the lowest uninsured rate ever. I mean, by many measures, we're living in the best economy in the history of the United States today. And obviously, inflation's too high. I'm not denying that. But on a lot of other measures, like we're kicking ass. It was sad to me that we couldn't get to a place where we could say, hey, a lot of things are going right. Like we're getting through COVID, the economy's booming, we've made the recovery, and inflation's too high. Like both of those things. But instead, what it became is, but inflation's too high. And but becomes a negation, right? It negates all the things that came before. And that was distortive. That was not accurate. I mean, and I think the media also on the economic issues kind of got overly negative. And I just want to say, as a way of closing out, is that I'm just I feel every day lucky to be an American. I love this country. I am so proud of the role that we've played in modern history of the world. I'm proud of the accomplishments of the American people during this unbelievable trauma of COVID. What did people do? They put their heads down, they went to work, they created a booming economy. Our economy is doing better than any economy in the developed world. It's an incredible testament to the grit, resilience, entrepreneurship of the American people. And and I just want to get to a place where we all feel better about the American project, because I think we are the greatest country in the world. I think we have so much to celebrate, and somehow that's become hard. And you, as a former Reaganite, right? Reagan was better at celebrating this sort of sentiment I'm describing than any modern politician. And we have to find that love of country, the pride that we have in this country, the celebrating the incredible resilience and grit of the American people. This is a big collective project of the left and the right. And that, we need the city on the hill Republicans to come back. We need the optimistic Clinton Democrats to come back. This is an amazing country, and we have to help the American people be proud to be here again. And I'd love to work with you on that going forward.
Amen, brother. All right, I got two quick things to say, and then I'm going to let you roll. I know you're busy. One, what you said about the DCCC, I didn't know that about how they went on offense. And that is really courageous, and I'll tell you why. There's this phenomenon, and we see it in the NFL, and it says that statistically speaking, you would be better off to never punt on fourth down. You should go for it. Try to get first down on fourth down. And more often than not, you're going to score more points. But nobody does that. Everybody punts on fourth down. And the reason is, at least according to, I think Malcolm Gladwell is the guy who postulated this idea, but it's because losing a game will not cost you your job or keep you from getting another job in the NFL. But being crazy, trying for the fourth down and missing it, the penalty, the cost is better than the potential benefit. And so if the DCCC had done what you recommended and it didn't work, that would have been devastating, right? Heads would have rolled. People would have said this is political malpractice. And so kudos to them. That was even more gutsy than people realize. The other thing about you, Simon, I'm thinking about this movie, The Big Short, and there was this guy in the movie, the drummer, and he's brilliant, and he discovers that the housing market is a bubble, and he wants to bet against the housing market, and everybody thinks he's crazy, all the smart people. And that reminds me of you today, because there are a lot of people who might have a hunch about something, but they don't talk about it because they know it's going to ruffle feathers. You had like this Big Short hunch where you saw that there was something nobody else was seeing, but rather than being quiet about it, I think you were more diplomatic than the guy in the movie, but you talked about it and talked about it and talked about it. So congratulations and kudos to you for that.
Well, can I just say one thing about that? Is that and it speaks to both of the points you just made, which is that I have this basic theory about politics, which is that if you're not on offense, you're losing. And that, playing defense is a sure sign of a losing enterprise. And so, I'm always on offense, right? I'm always trying to make the positive case. I'm always trying to lay down the positive track. There's a whole bunch of people who are really good at criticizing Democrats called Republicans. They're really good at that. So I don't need to do that, right? And that and so I appreciate what you're saying, but I also think the Democratic Party has to be better about going on offense and laying down positive tracks and not making Republican arguments for them by saying, well, the economy is good, but inflation is scary. So we ended up, I think, one of the big mistakes we made this election was we talked about inflation too much. And we didn't talk enough about how much better the economy had gotten. And I think we got spooked by this sort of the right-wing noise machine on this stuff. And I think if we had played the economy issue differently, I think we could have actually even had a better election. And who the hell knows? I mean, that's all speculative, but I mean, I don't really know. But listen, It's really been fun hanging out with you. I'm really proud of you. I mean, you're a courageous guy, and you're open to ideas and fighting it out every day. And just thank you for what you do. I'll tell you, I'm not a podcast guy because the last thing in the world I want to do when have free time is listen to politics, right? And so I don't really, but I've been really kind of blown away by the power of podcasts in the last 6 months. I think it's really an important development for our democracy. It makes all this stuff far more accessible to everyday people. You don't have the gatekeepers and the networks. And this is a really good development for our democracy. And just thank you for just staying in it and trying to do the right thing. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Simon Rosenberg. Thank you for coming back on the news.
Thank you so much.